Has someone ever taken credit for your work in the family?
When your parents call you out of the blue and say they want you to come over for a family meeting, you brace yourself for bad news, because in my experience, that's never the kind of phrase you hear before something good. I sat there at their kitchen table that night, wondering if maybe my dad's health had taken a turn or if they were about to announce they were selling the house and moving to some retirement village in Florida. Instead, I got a kind of news I didn't even know how to process in that moment. Not because I didn't expect it deep down, but because it was so cold and casual in the way they dropped it on me. My mom folded her hands like she was reading from a script and said, almost too cheerfully, that they had met with their lawyer and decided to leave everything to my brother. Mark, the house, the savings, the investments, even the lake cabin that I'd practically rebuilt with my own hands over the years. Then she gave me this little nod like she was waiting for me to smile and say, "Oh, of course, that makes perfect sense." I sat there and I nodded. I told them that was fine. No big reaction, no asking for an explanation, no, how could you do this to me? I just sat there sipping coffee like we were talking about what color they were thinking of painting the garage. And I could feel my brother sitting across from me with that smug half-smile he does when he thinks he's won some invisible game, like the golden boy had once again been given the prize simply for showing up. They both probably thought I was too stunned to argue or too polite to start a fight in their kitchen, but the truth was something entirely different. Because while my mouth was saying, "That's fine," my brain was already calculating the next move. I don't think they realized that you don't get to walk all over someone for years and expect them to just lay there and take it forever. And I had been in this position before, blindsided, cornered, told that my place in the family was somehow less important, and I had learned the hard way that if you're going to survive that kind of treatment, you have to start thinking several moves ahead, like a chess game you didn't even ask to play. The crazy part is, I didn't even feel sad in that moment. I think I skipped right over sad and landed on this calm, dangerous sort of clarity. I knew why they were doing it. They've always believed Mark needed more support because life was harder for him, or at least that's the story they tell themselves. It didn't matter that I was the one who took care of Mom when she had surgery, or that I helped Dad fix the roof last summer, or that I've never asked them for a single cent since I was 20. In their eyes, Mark has always been the one who needs them, and I'm the one who will just figure it out on my own. And you know what? They're not wrong about that last part. I do figure things out. So I nodded, said that's fine, and listened as they talked about how the will was now finalized and how they hoped I understood. I even told them I was happy for Mark, which made my brother grin like he'd just hit the jackpot at a casino. But what none of them saw coming was that I'd been preparing for something like this for a long time. Not because I knew they'd cut me out exactly, but because I'd learned over the years that it's never smart to be dependent on people who can turn on you the second it's convenient. I've kept my own financial world completely separate from theirs for over a decade, partly out of pride and partly out of survival instinct. I've got assets they don't know about, investments they couldn't even guess at, and contacts who owe me favors from way back when I helped them out in ways that never made it onto paper. And while my parents have been busy propping up my brother and telling me how lucky I am to be so independent, I've been quietly building a kind of insurance policy for moments exactly like this. It's funny, they thought they were delivering some kind of crushing blow that night, like they'd put me in my place once and for all. But sitting there, I realized they had no idea that the place they thought they'd assigned me was nowhere near where I actually stood. They were making decisions with the assumption that I needed what they were holding over my head, and the truth was I didn't. Not in the way they thought. So I left that night without a fight, hugged them both like everything was perfectly fine, and even told Mark I was sure he'd put all of it to good use. But as I drove away, I made myself a quiet promise. I wasn't going to fight them for what they had. I was going to make sure they wouldn't even have it to give away. And I could already see the first few moves taking shape in my mind, not out of spite, but out of something much sharper, something that comes from years of being underestimated. They thought the family meeting was the end of the conversation. They didn't realize it was just the beginning. I wish I could tell you that this thing my parents pulled came out of nowhere, that it was a freak decision made in a moment of bad judgment, and that before that night things had been fair and balanced. But the truth is that it was just the latest chapter in a story that had been playing out my entire life. A story where my brother was the lead actor and I was a background extra who just happened to carry most of the weight behind the scenes. From as far back as I can remember, Mark was the one who got the big wins without putting in the big work. When we were kids, he was the one who got the new bike while I was told I could use the old one for now because I was more careful with things. In high school, he was given a used car the second he turned 16, while I had to get a part-time job just to afford a clunky little thing that barely made it up the hill to our driveway. And even then my dad would shake his head like I had wasted money on something unreliable. When college came around, I worked 2 jobs just to cover my tuition and living expenses, and on more than one occasion, I had to skip meals to pay for textbooks. Mark, meanwhile, had his entire tuition, room, and board covered by our parents, plus a generous monthly allowance, so he wouldn't have to stress while focusing on his studies. The fact that he barely graduated, and only did so because I helped him rewrite half his final papers, was something nobody ever acknowledged. And then, when Mom got sick years later, it was me who took unpaid leave from work to drive her to every appointment, manage her medications, cook her meals, and keep the house in order. Mark came by maybe once every 2 weeks, sometimes less, usually staying just long enough to pat her hand and post something on social media about cherishing family moments, which of course earned him endless praise from friends and relatives who had no idea who was actually doing the real work. It wasn't just the big things either. It was every holiday, every birthday, every conversation where somehow the spotlight always shifted back to him. If I mentioned a promotion at work, Dad would immediately bring up how Mark had been asked to lead some project, even if it was just rearranging the stockroom at his job. If I talked about traveling somewhere, Mom would sigh and say she wished Mark could afford to take trips like that, as if my successes were just a reminder of his shortcomings instead of something worth celebrating. Over time, I learned to stop sharing much about my life, because no matter what I did, it was either minimized or used as a backdrop to highlight whatever Mark was doing, no matter how minor. So when they sat me down that night and told me the will had been changed, I didn't feel blindsided in the way some people might. I felt confirmed. It was the culmination of decades of decisions that had quietly told me where I stood in their world. The thing is, though, I also knew something they didn't. I knew that being underestimated could be the most powerful advantage in the world if you were smart enough to use it. And I had learned how to use it. For years, I had been building a life they didn't really see. They thought of me as independent in the sense that I could take care of myself without their help, but what they didn't realize was that I had also been strategic. I had a career they didn't fully understand, assets they had no idea existed, and connections in places they couldn't imagine. While they were busy funneling every resource into keeping Mark afloat, I had been quietly making moves that would ensure I could stand on my own no matter what happened. And it wasn't just about money. It was about knowing how people work, how they make decisions, and how to steer situations without anyone realizing your hand is on the wheel. When I thought about the way they'd always justified giving Mark more, saying he needed the help or that he wasn't as strong as me, I realized something. If they believed he needed constant propping up, then that meant he was vulnerable in ways they refused to see. And if he was vulnerable, then all I had to do was give him exactly what he thought he wanted, in a way that would set the stage for him to take himself down. That way, I wouldn't have to be the bad guy, at least not in the way they'd expect. They would never see the knife until it was already in the table, and even then they'd be looking for who threw it instead of realizing it had been there the whole time. The more I thought about it, the more it stopped feeling like some kind of moral dilemma and started feeling like balance. For years, I had been told to be the bigger person, to step aside, to let him have his way, just this once, except just this once had turned into a lifetime. And maybe it was time to stop stepping aside and start stepping into the space they had cleared for him, not because I wanted what he had, but because I wanted to make sure he never got to keep taking from everyone else without ever facing the cost. I wasn't going to storm into their house and demand my share. That would have been loud, messy, and exactly what they'd expect from someone who felt wronged. Instead, I decided I would play this the way they had played me my whole life, quietly, patiently, and with the kind of subtlety that makes people think you're harmless right up until the moment they realize you've been holding the winning hand the entire time. And I knew exactly where to start. When I made the decision to move forward with my plan, I understood right from the start that the key to making it work was patience, because if there's one thing that makes people careless, it's believing they've already won. And I knew that if I rushed or made any obvious moves, I'd lose the advantage that came from them underestimating me. So I began by doing something that probably looked to them like retreat. I stopped coming over for family dinners. I let their calls go to voicemail more often than not, and when I did answer, I kept the conversation short and bland, never offering anything personal they could pick apart. I knew that to make Mark feel secure, I had to appear detached, maybe even a little hurt, because people love believing they've put someone in their place, and I needed him to believe exactly that. While I was keeping my distance on the surface, I was busy laying the groundwork behind the scenes. I reached out to people I hadn't spoken to in years, people who either owed me favors or simply trusted me enough to talk openly. One of the first was a realtor I'd helped years back when she was just starting out, someone who now handled high-value properties and knew exactly how to dig up details on ownership, mortgages, and liens without leaving a trail that could point back to me. From her, I learned that my parents had taken out a line of credit against the house a few years ago, something they probably considered minor, but which meant the property wasn't as secure as they liked to believe. More interestingly, I found out that Mark's finances were a lot shakier than anyone in the family realized. He had debts, not just the kind you make a payment on each month, but messy, high-interest debts that were the result of impulsive spending and a few failed business ideas that he had never mentioned to our parents. That piece of information became the foundation for everything else. I didn't need to directly sabotage him. I just needed to create an opportunity for him to sabotage himself. People like Mark, who are used to being bailed out, tend to believe that no matter what happens, someone will step in to rescue them. It makes them reckless. It also makes them predictable, because when a shiny opportunity lands in their lap, they don't stop to ask too many questions, they just grab it, assuming that if it goes wrong, someone else will deal with the fallout. I realized all I had to do was deliver that shiny opportunity at the right time and in the right way. So I called an old friend, someone who had worked in investment consulting and now operated in a more flexible space. He understood risk, but more importantly, he understood how to make something look irresistible to a person who wanted to appear smart and ambitious without doing the actual work. We spent hours going over the details of a fictional but very convincing real estate investment. Nothing illegal, but high risk enough to be dangerous if someone went in over their head. The idea was to make it look like a golden ticket, one that would give Mark a quick and impressive return, but only if he put in a substantial amount up front. And the best part was that, with a little creative framing, we could make it look like I was doing him a favor by connecting him to it, which would instantly lower his guard. While all of this was coming together, I maintained the act with my parents. When they called to check in, I told them I was just keeping busy with work and that I didn't want to cause any tension, so I was giving everyone space. I could hear the satisfaction in their voices, the way they seemed to think the problem had solved itself, and that told me the plan was working. Mark, in particular, seemed to think he had completely neutralized me, which only made him more open to casual conversations when I did see him. I started dropping little comments about how I'd been hearing about new investment opportunities from people I used to work with, saying I didn't have the time or the interest to get involved myself, but that maybe he would, since he was always talking about wanting to grow his wealth. I made sure to say it casually, almost as if it were an afterthought, and I watched his eyes light up exactly the way I expected. I knew he wouldn't jump on it immediately, because that would require initiative, and Mark has never been someone who takes initiative unless he thinks the payoff is guaranteed. So I let a few weeks pass, mentioning it just enough to keep it in his mind, until finally he asked me for more details. That's when I connected him with my friend, who played his part perfectly, friendly but slightly aloof, just enough to make Mark feel like he was being given access to something exclusive. Within a month, Mark was in deep, convinced he was on the verge of a major financial win. He had borrowed against his own assets, stretched his credit, and even hinted to our parents that he might need to pull some funds from them temporarily, though of course he promised them it was only a short-term thing until the big return came in. Watching it unfold, I kept my distance because if there's one thing you never want to do in a situation like this, it's hover too close. I wanted him to believe he was doing it all on his own, that I was barely even aware of the details. The more he felt in control, the less likely he was to question the wisdom of his decisions. And the best part was that, as far as anyone could see, I was just the helpful sister who had passed along a lead. I wasn't forcing his hand. I wasn't manipulating him, at least not in a way that could ever be proven. It was almost too easy, but I reminded myself that easy doesn't mean finished. The real move wasn't just getting him into the game. The real move was waiting for the exact moment when the game would turn, when the weight of his own decisions would start pulling him under, and when our parents would finally see that the golden boy wasn't untouchable after all. And I could feel that moment getting closer every single day. The beauty of a plan like this is that once the right pieces are in motion, you don't have to keep pushing or steering too aggressively, because people like Mark will take care of that part themselves, and in his case, the moment he thought he had an inside track on something valuable, his ego did the rest of the work for me. I kept my role almost invisible, only checking in with him when he brought it up first, never asking for updates, and certainly never offering unsolicited advice, because if there's one thing I've learned about him, it's that the second you question his judgment, he digs in deeper, almost as if he has to prove you wrong just for doubting him. That's exactly what I wanted, for him to pour himself into this thing without ever considering that maybe he should slow down, double-check the details, or even ask someone with real expertise for a second opinion. It didn't take long for him to start talking bigger than he could back up. I'd hear from my parents that he was already planning what he'd do with his profits, which included upgrading their kitchen, buying a boat, and taking them on some lavish trip as a thank you. Naturally, this only reinforced their belief that Mark was some kind of financial visionary finally coming into his own, and it made them more willing to help him if he said he needed short-term funds to maximize his investment. They were so blinded by the fantasy of him succeeding that they didn't even stop to ask basic questions like why, if this was such a sure thing, he couldn't fund it entirely himself. I knew they were probably moving money around to give him more breathing room, but I didn't interfere, because every dollar they tied to his risk was one more layer of inevitability in the outcome I was building toward. The turning point came when my friend, the investment contact, mentioned to Mark that a larger share had unexpectedly become available because another investor had pulled out. It was presented as a rare chance to increase his stake and therefore his eventual payout, but it also required a significant additional contribution. I knew exactly how Mark would take that, not as a warning sign, but as an opportunity he'd be stupid to miss. True to form, he jumped at it, and when he couldn't scrape together enough cash on his own, he borrowed even more from our parents, who were now so invested emotionally and financially that they probably felt it would be foolish to stop supporting him before the big win. It was almost surreal watching this happen, because from the outside, I could see every red flag waving in front of them, and yet not one of them slowed down enough to notice. Mark was walking himself right into a position where he was overextended on every front, financially, reputationally, and emotionally, but because it all looked like progress, they were celebrating him instead of questioning him. I didn't need to undermine him in any overt way, because the structure of the deal itself was designed to eventually collapse under its own weight, and he was reinforcing it every time he doubled down. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. The opportunity closed. My friend informed Mark that the development had fallen through due to unexpected complications, which, in the real world, meant that the investment vehicle was now effectively worthless. There was no fraud, no illegal activity, just a failed venture that carried the exact risk it was supposed to. The kind of thing any seasoned investor would warn you could happen, and the kind of thing someone like Mark, with no real experience, would never imagine could actually happen to him. I stayed completely out of sight during those first few days after the news hit, letting the silence do the damage, because nothing rattles a person's confidence more than realizing the people they were bragging to a week ago aren't calling them now. From what I later heard, the panic set in almost immediately. Mark started scrambling, calling the bank, trying to negotiate extensions, maybe even thinking he could somehow spin the loss into a temporary setback. But the reality was that he had borrowed against everything: his savings, his car, even part of the equity in our parents' house, and those debts didn't care about his excuses. And this is where the real dominoes began to fall, because once the bank gets involved in something tied to property, the clock starts ticking on solutions, and in their case, the only viable solution was to liquidate something substantial to cover the gap. Our parents, still clinging to the belief that this was just a hiccup, were slow to react, which only made the situation worse. By the time they accepted that there was no salvaging the investment, the only way to clear the debt and keep themselves from facing legal trouble was to put the house on the market. I don't think it even crossed their minds that the very asset they had promised to Mark was now at risk of vanishing entirely, because in their minds, losses like this were temporary. Someone would come along to fix it, just like they had been fixing his mistakes for decades. And that's when I made my move. I contacted a holding company I had set up years ago, one they didn't know I controlled, and I put in an offer on the house through them. The price was fair enough to clear their debts and give them some leftover cash, so they didn't suspect anything unusual. To them, it was just an anonymous buyer who happened to appear at exactly the right moment. And I let them believe that, because the timing was perfect, Mark had nothing left to stand on, they had no choice but to sell, and I could take ownership without ever having to confront them directly. By the time the sale was finalized, the damage was done. The house was no longer theirs to promise, Mark was left holding nothing but bills, and I was in the position I'd been quietly moving toward since that family meeting, the one where they thought they'd shut me out for good. They still didn't know I was behind it, but that part was coming, and when it did, I wasn't planning to gloat. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't an accident, that the balance had finally shifted, and that the person they'd underestimated all these years was the one who held the keys now. The closing date came faster than any of them expected, partly because I made sure my offer was clean, with no contingencies, and partly because once the bank applied pressure, my parents were too exhausted and too desperate to drag things out. I stayed completely in the background during the process, letting my attorney and the holding company handle every detail, and when the final signatures were in place, I had the deed in my possession without a single direct conversation about it with my family. It was almost strange how easy it was. After years of being told I wasn't entitled to anything, I now owned the one thing they had spent decades acting like was some sacred inheritance that only my brother could ever deserve. The satisfaction didn't come from the property itself, it came from knowing I had dismantled the whole structure of their favoritism without ever raising my voice or demanding my share. I waited 2 weeks before arranging the final reveal, because I wanted the shock to land in a way they'd remember, not as a dramatic outburst, but as a calm statement of fact. My parents called me one afternoon asking if I could come to the house to talk things over now that the dust had settled. They said Mark would be there too, and the way my mom phrased it, "We just need to figure out where to go from here," told me they still saw themselves as the ones in control, as if this was just another family matter where they could set the terms. I agreed, told them I'd be there, and then made one small but important choice. I didn't go in empty-handed. I brought the keys. When I walked into the living room, they were all sitting there, my dad looking tired, my mom looking like she'd been crying, and Mark looking like he'd been punched in the gut but was trying to play it off. They started talking immediately, mostly about how they were trying to find a new place and how they still couldn't believe how unfair it was that things had turned out this way. I let them talk for a while, not interrupting, because every word they spoke just made it clearer that they still hadn't put the pieces together. Eventually, my mom said something about the new owner and how they were hoping whoever it was would let them stay in the house a little longer while they figured things out. That's when I put the keys on the coffee table. For a few seconds, no one moved. My dad glanced at them, confused, and Mark frowned like he didn't understand what he was looking at. Then I said, in the most even tone I could manage, "You don't have to ask the new owner. You're looking at her." The silence that followed was the kind you can almost hear ringing in your ears. My mom's face went pale, my dad leaned back like he'd just been hit with a sudden wave of vertigo, and Mark's jaw actually dropped. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat, I didn't raise my voice. I just let the weight of the truth settle on them. Mark was the first to speak, and, predictably, it came out as an accusation. He demanded to know if I had set this up, if I had been planning it from the start, as though the idea that he might have simply walked himself into disaster was too much for him to accept. I didn't deny it, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of a detailed confession either. I just told him, "You were given everything you ever asked for, and you still managed to lose it. I just made sure it landed in the right hands when you did." My dad started to say something about family loyalty, about how we should be helping each other, and I cut him off, not angrily, but with a finality that left no room for argument. I did help. I kept this house from going to strangers. That's more than anyone here ever did for me. The truth is, I could have let them keep living there under some arrangement if I wanted to. I could have used it as leverage or held it over them for years. But I didn't want to turn it into some drawn-out punishment. The point wasn't to control them, it was to make sure they understood that I wasn't the expendable afterthought they had spent a lifetime treating me as. So I told them I'd give them a reasonable amount of time to move out, that there would be no tricks, no sudden eviction, but also no staying indefinitely. This wasn't about cruelty, it was about ending the pattern for good. I left that day without looking back, because I didn't need to see the aftermath. I knew the conversation they'd have after I walked out would be the one where, for the first time, they'd have to acknowledge that the version of me they'd been dealing with all these years was gone. They'd see that the independence they always used as an excuse to favor my brother had become the very thing that made it possible for me to take away the one thing they thought was untouchable. And as for Mark, I imagine he's still trying to convince himself it wasn't really his fault, because people like him rarely learn from their failures unless they're forced to, and even then, it's hit or miss. Driving away, I thought about that family meeting, the smug way he'd smiled, the way they'd looked at me like I was supposed to be gracious about being erased from the future. And I realized something that made me laugh, not in a joyful way, but in the way you laugh when you finally see the full picture. They had spent my entire life teaching me that in our family, the person who plays the long game wins. They just never thought I'd be the one using that lesson against them. So maybe the only real question left is whether I was wrong for doing exactly what they taught me to do, take care of family, just not in the way they expected.